The sun in that high desert country didn't just shine. It pressed down, baking the red earth and painting long, sharp shadows from the mesquite and sage. In an Apache camp, nestled against a rocky hillside for shelter, life moved to the old rhythms. Women worked hides stretched on frames. The smell of smoke and cooking beans hung in the air, and children's laughter echoed as they chased a dusty dog. But for one little girl, the world held a quiet distance. From her earliest memory, she knew her face was different. A vast, dark mark, the color of a deep wine or a summer storm cloud, spread across one side of her features. It was a birthmark, something the doctors far away might have a name for. But here, her people had their own understanding. They were a spiritual people, seeing signs and stories in the world around them. To some, the mark looked like the bold wing of a raven. To others, it was a shadow from another life. They called it the raven's wing in hushed tones, and with the name came a belief that it might be a sign of misfortune. A burden carried from a spirit world. No one was cruel to her, not outright. Her mother's hands were still gentle when she braided her hair. Her father's eyes still held a sad kind of love. But she felt the separation like a physical wall. When the women gathered to grind corn, she would be given a task, but the easy, flowing talk would soften around her, becoming polite and careful. During games, the other children would sometimes pause, their eyes lingering on her face with a curiosity that felt like a pinch. She was not invited to listen to certain stories by the fire, the ones about the cleverness of fox or the origins of the mountain spirits. It was thought quietly that her presence might not be right for such things. So, the girl, whose name was known but seldom called with joy by anyone outside her immediate family, learned to find her place at the edges. She became a watcher, her dark eyes missing nothing. She saw how her aunt prepared a poultice for a wound, noticing which leaves were used. She watched the way the horses moved, understanding which one was nervous by the flick of an ear. Her world became not the busy center of the camp, but the silent, open places just beyond it. She would walk out into the arroyos, the dry creek beds cut into the earth by long-ago rains. There, the only whispers were the wind through the canyon walls. She would sit for hours, tracing patterns in the sand with a stick, the sun warm on her skin. The lizards and the rabbits did not care about her face. The sturdy little cactus, blooming a defiant yellow, did not turn away. In this solitude, she built a strength inside herself, brick by quiet brick. She spoke to the land, and in its vast accepting silence, she felt an answer. It did not see a mark. It saw a living creature, a part of itself. But back in the wickiup, the dwelling made of brush and hide she shared with her family, the loneliness could be a heavy weight. She would hear the distant sounds of a ceremony, the steady beat of the drum feeling like a heartbeat she was not connected to. She wondered why the spirits would mark her so, what she had done before she was born to deserve this quiet exile. Her mother would try to comfort her, saying she was special, that the raven was also a bird of great intelligence. But the girl knew the difference between being called special and being included. As the seasons turned and she grew from a child into a young woman, the divide only became clearer. Other girls her age began to take on new roles, their families discussing potential marriages, their skills in beadwork or basket weaving praised openly. For her, there were no such discussions. She was an excellent weaver herself, her patterns complex and beautiful, but her baskets were often traded or given without the same fanfare. She was like a useful tool, appreciated in function but set apart. She carried herself with a quiet grace, a dignity that was her armor. She met the occasional stare from a visitor to the camp, not with a flinch, but with a steady, calm look that often made the other person glance away first. Inside, however, a question began to form, a small, stubborn seed. Was this all her life would be? A permanent shadow at the edge of the firelight, growing older, always watching, but never truly belonging? The land she loved offered comfort, but it could not offer conversation. It could not offer a shared smile or the warmth of a hand in hers. The desert, in its harsh way, taught survival. It taught that even the most delicate flower could push through cracked earth. The girl, marked by the raven's wing, was learning to be that flower. Her spirit, though often lonely, was not broken. It was waiting. She did not know it yet, but her life of watching from the edges had given her a gift. It had given her the ability to truly see the truth in a person's eyes, beyond their first reaction. And soon, from a distance she had never expected, a pair of eyes would look back at her, and they would see not a shadow, but a person. The long, quiet chapter of her exile was coming to an end, and the wind was about to change. The years settled on the young Apache woman like the fine, red dust of the desert, a constant layer that defined the shape of her life. The initial sting of childhood whispers had hardened into a quiet, accepted fact. She was of her people, but not fully among them. Her world had shrunk to a small, familiar circle, the wickiup of her aging parents, the cooking fire, the well-worn path to the washing stones by the creek, and her beloved, solitary walks into the broken land of canyons and mesas. Her parents, their own hair graying, watched her with a sorrow they could not fix. They spoke in low tones when they thought she was asleep. The concern was no longer just about the mark, but about the future. Who would care for her when they were gone? In their culture, a woman's security was woven into the family, into marriage. For her, that thread seemed permanently cut. A few times, men from other bands had visited, their eyes sliding over her with a quick, dismissive flicker before moving on to other, unmarked faces. It was a silent verdict, delivered again and again, so she made herself useful in the ways she could. Her hands were never still. She became known, in that limited way, for her baskets. She didn't just weave them. She told stories with them. Using different shades of willow and devil's claw, she would work patterns of running horses, of rain clouds over mountains, of the zigzag path of lightning. She'd take them to the trading post sometimes, a long walk she didn't mind. The white shopkeeper would grunt, examine her work with a practical eye, and give her a few coins or trade for cloth and thread. He never commented on her face, only on the tightness of the weave. In a strange way, she appreciated that. It was a transaction, clean and simple. More and more, her deepest conversations were with the animals. The horses of the camp knew her. She was the one who would approach slowly, speaking in a soft, steady stream of Apache, her hand outstretched. She could calm a skittish young pony when the men could not. She noticed things, a slight limp, a dullness in the coat, and would point them out. The men would listen, because she was always right, but they would then turn and walk away without another word, as if the knowledge had come from the air itself. Not from her. There were days when the loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow feeling right under her ribs. She would see sisters laughing together, braiding each other's hair. She would see a young couple sharing a secret smile. These were glimpses into a world from which she was locked out. On those days, she would walk further than usual, until the camp was just a smudge of smoke on the horizon. She'd climb a high rock and let the wind, fierce and unfeeling, whip at her clothes and hair. She'd scream sometimes, not words, just a raw sound that the wind would snatch and carry away instantly. And then she'd sit, emptied out, and watch the hawks circling on the thermal currents. They were alone, too, but they were masters of their sky. She tried to feel that way master of her own silent, stark kingdom. Back in camp, her presence became a kind of normal ghost story. For the children, she was a slight figure of mystery. Mothers would sometimes use her as a quiet caution. "Don't wander too far, or you'll end up alone like her," they might say, not meaning to be cruel, but stating what they saw as a fact of life. The older people viewed her with a kind of distant pity, mixed with a persistent, low-level superstition. If a horse went lame before a hunt, or a pot cracked for no reason, no one would blame her aloud, but a glance might flicker in her direction. She carried this weight, this unspoken responsibility for small misfortunes, without complaint. It was her burden to bear, as permanent as the mark on her skin. She lived in two solitudes. One was the visible solitude of the camp, the empty space around her at mealtimes, the conversations that dipped when she approached. The other was the solitude she chose, out in the desert, which was full of life and detail. She knew where the first purple phlox would bloom after a rain, where the quail hid their nests, how to find the tiny sweet berries that grew in the shade of the rocks. This was her real home, this demanding, beautiful, unforgiving landscape. It asked nothing of her but respect, and in return, it gave her a sense of scale. Her problems felt small under the immense, star-filled sky. She began to think this would be all, that her story was already written. The marked girl who became the quiet woman, who became the old woman who knew herbs and baskets, who lived and died on the edges of her own story. The thought didn't fill her with panic anymore, just a deep, weary acceptance. Her hope, a small, flickering flame, was almost out, but life has a way of changing directions when you least expect it, like a sudden gust of wind twisting the smoke from a fire. The change began with something ordinary, a need for horses. The Apache had strong, savvy horses, and the ranches that now bordered the reservation often needed more. A small group of men from one of these ranches was coming to talk trade. It was business, nothing new. The camp buzzed with mild activity. Horses were gathered. The men who would do the talking prepared Dot. She paid little mind. These dealings were for the men. She planned to spend the day at the creek, washing some blankets and working on a new basket, a pattern of geometric waves that gave her mind something to focus on. Her life was a slow, quiet river, and this visit was just a stone on the bank, having nothing to do with her current. She had no reason to believe that this particular stone was about to be picked up and thrown, sending ripples that would change the course of everything. The morning of the trade dawned clear and sharp. Word had moved through the camp, and a different kind of energy was in the air. It wasn't the energy of ceremony, but of business and caution. The men of the camp gathered, their faces serious. They spoke of the horses they might part with, of the tools or cloth they hoped to get in return. The women went about their work, but their glances kept drifting toward the main path leading into the reservation. Visitors from the outside world were always an event, a break in the routine. She had decided to stay near the edge of the activity. She took a half-finished basket and a bundle of reeds and settled on a low, flat rock not far from the main cluster of wickiups. From here, she could see the comings and goings without being in the middle of it. She pulled her work into her lap, her fingers automatically finding the rhythm of the weave, over and under, pulling tight. The familiar motion was a comfort. Then they arrived. 4 men on horseback, coming in at a slow walk. They were cowboys. That much was clear from a distance. Their wide-brimmed hats, their boots, the way they sat their saddles with a loose, easy posture. They dismounted near the group of Apache men who had come forward to meet them. There were nods, quiet greetings. The talk began, slow and measured. She kept her eyes mostly on her work, but like everyone else, she was watching. 3 of the cowboys were younger, talking more, their eyes darting around the camp with open curiosity. But the 4th one was different. He was older, his face lined from years in the sun. His movements were slower, more deliberate. He didn't do much of the talking. Instead, he listened, his gaze steady on the Apache man speaking. He seemed to be assessing the horses that had been brought forward with a practical, knowing eye. The discussion moved toward the horses. The men walked over to where a few of the tribe's best were tethered. The cowboys began looking them over, checking their teeth, running hands down their legs. It was then that a young, paint-spotted pony, not part of the trade group, but tied nearby, suddenly spooked. A dog had barked, and the pony jerked back, eyes rolling, pulling against its rope. One of the younger cowboys stepped closer, trying to help, but his sudden movement made the pony more nervous. It danced sideways, snorting. The older cowboy held up a hand, stopping the younger man. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm, though she was too far to hear the words. He didn't approach the horse directly. Instead, he just stood still, letting the animal see he wasn't a threat. Seeing the commotion, she set her basket down. She knew this pony. It was spirited but kind-hearted, and it was scared. Without really thinking about it, she stood and walked over, not toward the men, but in a wide arc toward the pony's side. She moved slowly, the way you move toward a frightened creature, making no sudden motions. She began to speak, not in a whisper, but in a soft, steady stream of Apache. "Be calm, little one. It's just noise. The dog is foolish. You are safe." Her voice was a gentle hum. She didn't look at the men, only at the pony. She kept her hands at her sides as she came nearer. Then slowly, she raised one hand and let the pony sniff her fingers. She kept talking nonsense words of comfort, her tone as even as a flat rock. The pony blew out a hard breath, then lowered its head, nudging her hand. She smiled then, a small private thing, and gently took hold of its rope, stroking its neck with her other hand. In moments, the animal was settled, standing quietly beside her Dot. It was only then that she looked up, and her eyes met those of the older cowboy. He hadn't moved. He was watching her, had been watching the whole time. His gaze wasn't on the settled horse, but on her. He looked at her face, at the dark mark that spread across her skin. She was used to this look, the quick glance, the flicker of surprise, the immediate turning away. She braced for it, but it didn't come. His eyes held no shock, no pity, no fear. There was a quiet intensity in them, a deep curiosity. He looked from her eyes to the now calm pony and back again. He saw the connection she had made, the trust she had built in just a few moments. He saw the skill in it, the quiet authority. He saw her. He gave a small, slow nod. It wasn't a nod of thanks. Exactly. It was a nod of recognition, of respect, as if to say, "Asterisk, I see what you did there. That was well done." A feeling shot through her, so strange and sudden, it almost made her dizzy. It was the feeling of being truly seen. Not looked at, not stared at, but seen. For the first time in her life, a stranger's eyes held no judgment about the mark. They held only an honest assessment of the person standing in front of him. One of the Apache men said something, and the cowboy broke his gaze, turning back to the business at hand. The moment was over, but the air felt different. The world felt tilted, just a little. She led the pony to a more secure post, her heart beating oddly in her chest. She went back to her rock and her basket, but her fingers were clumsy now. She couldn't find the rhythm. She kept seeing those steady, calm eyes. The trading went on for a while longer. An agreement was reached. Hands were shaken. The cowboys prepared to leave, leading the new horses they had bought. As the older man mounted his own horse, he turned in the saddle. His eyes scanned the edge of the camp and found her again, still sitting on her rock. He didn't smile. He just touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, a small, polite gesture. Then he turned his horse and rode out with the others. She sat there long after the dust from their horses had settled. The camp returned to its normal rhythms, the buzz of the visit fading. But inside her, a door she didn't even know was closed had been nudged open, just a crack. A single shaft of light had fallen into the quiet, dark room of her solitude. He had seen her. And for the first time, she wondered what it might be like to be seen again. For days, the memory of the cowboy's gaze was like a smooth stone she carried in her pocket. She would find her fingers worrying over the thought of it as she worked. The look in his eyes hadn't been like anything she knew. It was solid, real. It didn't slip away from her face, but had rested there, taking her in without flinching. That small nod, the touch to his hat brim, these were gestures that played again and again in her mind. They were seeds of something unfamiliar, a possibility. A week passed, then another. The practical rhythms of survival kept her busy. She needed more of the special reeds for her baskets, the kind that grew along a creek that bordered the reservation land near where the white ranches began. It was a longer walk, one she didn't make often. She set out early, a quiet purpose in her steps. The creek was cool and clear, whispering over stones. She was knee-deep in the water, gathering the long, straight shoots when a shadow fell across the stream. She looked up, her heart giving a hard, sudden thump dot. It was him, the older cowboy. He was on foot, holding the reins of his horse. He stood on the bank as if he had been waiting, or perhaps as surprised as she was. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The sounds of the creek and the wind filled the silence. He was the one who spoke first. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice the same low, calm rumble she remembered. He spoke English, but slowly, his words simple. "I'm checking the fence line. It runs near here." She nodded, not sure what to say. She knew some English from the trading post, but words felt clumsy in her mouth. She stepped out of the water onto the bank, holding her bundle of reeds. His eyes went to them. "For your baskets," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said, the word feeling strange. "The one you were working on," he said. It had a good pattern, like waves. She was stunned he had noticed. She had been so far away, just a woman on a rock. Yet he had seen the pattern in her lap. He saw things. This man truly saw things. He shifted on his feet, a little awkward. "I was thinking," he began, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "That pony, the one that spooked, he's got a tenderness in his left front foot. Not a stone. Could be the start of a softness in the hoof. You might tell your people to check it." He wasn't giving an order. He was sharing an observation, man too. Well, to her. As if her people were her people, and she could pass the word. "I will tell them," she said. He nodded, satisfied. Another silence fell, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people used to the quiet of open spaces. "My name is John," he said finally. "But most folks call me Jack." She looked at him, at the honest lines of his face. It felt like a gift, him offering his name. In her culture, names held meaning. She gave him hers, the Apache name her mother had given her, a name meaning wise one who watches. He repeated it slowly, trying the sounds. He didn't get it quite right, but he tried. That meant more than if he had just nodded dot, and so it began. Not with grand declarations, but with these small, deliberate crossings of paths. A week later, he was at the trading post when she came to sell 2 baskets. He was buying nails and flour. He tipped his hat. "Baskets turned out fine," he remarked. She simply nodded, but a warmth spread in her chest another time. He found her in a dry canyon where she was collecting a certain kind of clay for dye. He was tracking a stray cow. He showed her the track, explaining how the cow was favoring a leg. She showed him the clay and how, when mixed, it would make a deep red color. He listened, truly listened. Their conversations were like two streams slowly merging. He told her of the ranch, of coming west as a young man, of a life spent with cattle and weather. She spoke of the land, the names of plants, and what they were for, the way the stars told stories. They met in the space between their worlds, a narrow, secret place where only the two of them existed. He never once spoke of her mark, never asked about it. It was as if it was simply a part of her, like her dark eyes or her skilled hands, not something to be remarked upon, just a fact. For her, this was a miracle. It was like being able to breathe deeply after a lifetime of shallow breaths. One afternoon, sitting under the shade of a cottonwood tree, he turned to her. His face was more serious than she had ever seen it. "This is no kind of life for you," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "Stuck between here and there. Not belonging." Her throat tightened. He saw that too. He saw the loneliness that was the core of her. "I have a small cabin," he continued, looking down at his work-worn hands. "It's on a piece of land I've got a claim on. It's humble, needs work, but it's quiet. It could be a place for you." He looked up at her then, his eyes clear and direct. "I am asking you to come with me, to be my wife." The world seemed to stop. The wind stilled. The creek's babble faded. Here was the choice, laid out bare and plain. On one side, the only life she had ever known, a life of silence and shadows on the edges of her own people. A safe, known loneliness. On the other side, a vast and terrifying unknown. A white man's world that had no place for someone like her. A world of stares and whispers that would be cruel. Not just cautious, but on that other side was also him. Jack, the one person who looked at her and saw a whole person. Tears pricked her eyes, but they did not fall. She thought of her parents, their worried faces. They would not understand. To them, it would be as if she were disappearing into a storm. She thought of the women at the camp who would shake their heads and say it was the curse finally taking her away. She would be a story they told, a warning. Then she looked at Jack's face. He wasn't promising her an easy life. His face promised hardship, work, and certain struggle. But it also promised something she had never had: partnership, recognition, a shared glance across a room, a hand to hold in the dark. The lonely girl who had walked the arroyos had built a fortress of self-reliance. The woman she had become could use that strength now, not just for survival, but for a leap into the terrifying unknown. She took a deep, shaky breath. The desert had taught her that life was harsh, but that it could also break open with unexpected beauty after a hard rain. This man was her hard rain. She looked straight into his steady eyes and gave a single, firm nod. "Yes," she said, It was the most important word she had ever spoken. It was not an end to her exile, but the brave, frightening start of a journey to find a home. The world she stepped into was harsher than she had imagined. Leaving the reservation was a quiet, somber affair. Her mother wept silent tears, her father's face a mask of stoic worry. They could not bless a path they did not understand, but they did not try to stop her. To the rest of the camp, her departure was a confirmation of old stories. The marked woman was leaving, perhaps as she was always meant to. They watched her go with a sense of closure, not of loss. Jack's cabin was exactly as he described, humble. It was a simple structure of logs, set in a small, grassy clearing surrounded by pine and juniper. It had a dirt floor, a stone fireplace, and a single window. It was nothing like the wickiup of her childhood, but it had a solidity to it. It was a real roof, a real door that could shut. And it was theirs. The outside world, however, had no place for them. When Jack took her to the nearest town for supplies, the air changed. People stopped talking to stare. Men tipped their hats back on their heads, their eyes wide with disbelief. Women pulled their children closer, turning them away as if looking at her might harm them. Whispers, sharp and clear, followed them down the dusty street. Asterisk, is that a... What is he thinking? Look at her face. Asterisk Jack's arm would tighten around her shoulders. He never reacted to the words, but his jaw would set, a hard line of granite. He would look straight ahead, his posture a wall between her and the world. He would speak to the shopkeeper in his normal, steady voice, ordering flour, coffee, nails, as if everything was perfectly fine. His calm was a shelter. He was staying, just as he said he would, right there beside her in the storm of their disapproval. Back at the cabin, they built their life from the ground up, brick by quiet brick. He worked the small herd of cattle on their claim, mended fences, and broke the stubborn soil for a garden. She took the little cabin and made it a home. She packed mud into the cracks between the logs to keep out the wind. She wove rushes into mats for the floor. Using her baskets as trade, she got some cloth and sewed curtains for the window. She planted a garden not just with the vegetables Jack knew, but with herbs from her old life things for cooking, for tea, for soothing salves. Their communication was a language beyond words. A touch on the arm, a shared look across the table as the lamplight flickered. He taught her more English. She taught him words in Apache for the things around them, the trees, the animals, the weather. They were two solitary people learning, for the first time, how to not be alone. The prejudice was a constant, low-grade fever. Cowboys from neighboring spreads would sometimes ride by, shouting crude things over the fence line. Jack would straighten up from his work, his hand resting on the handle of his hammer or the post he was setting, and say nothing. His silence was more powerful than any shout. He would just stare at them until their laughter died, and they rode on, unsettled by his quiet defiance. Once, a traveling preacher came to their door, seeing the smoke from their chimney. When he saw her, his smile vanished. He spoke not to her, but to Jack, asking if he knew he was living in sin with a savage. Jack, without raising his voice, told the man that his wife was a better Christian in her heart than any man who judged by looks alone. Then he closed the door softly in the preacher's shocked face. She stood behind him, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. She bore him children, 2 sons, and later a daughter. With each pregnancy, the fear returned. Would her children bear a mark? Would they be shunned as she had been? But they were born perfect and whole, their skin clear. As they grew, she saw both of them in their faces, Jack's steady gaze, her own dark hair. She taught them to see the world with 2 sets of eyes, to understand the ways of the ranch, and to respect the stories of the land, the names of the plants, the language of the birds. The birthmark on her face never faded. To her children, it was simply a part of their mother, as familiar as her smile or the sound of her voice singing them to sleep. To Jack, it was the map that had led him to her. In their family story, told on winter nights by the fire, it became not a curse, but a sign. The raven's wing, they would call it. The raven, their mother would explain, was not just a bird of mystery, but the cleverest of creatures, a teacher. And the wing, their father would add, was what had sheltered them all, bringing their family together. They were not rich. Life was often hard, a daily negotiation with drought, cold, and sickness. But they were rich in the quiet understanding that filled their home. The silence between them was no longer the silence of exile, but the comfortable, peaceful silence of 2 people who have said all that needs to be said without speaking a word. Years turned into decades. The sharp sting of the world's judgment softened, worn down by their unwavering presence. Neighbors, one by one, came to accept them. not because they suddenly approved, but because they could not deny the evidence before their eyes. A man and a woman who worked hard, raised honest children, and bothered no one. The woman with the marked face became simply Mrs. Barr, a woman who could heal a burn with her salves, and whose baskets were the finest at the county fair. One evening, very old now, they sat together on the porch she had built for her years before. The sunset painted the sky in colors of rose and gold. Her hand, wrinkled and spotted with age, was tucked securely in his. The vast silence of the land they loved settled around them. A blanket of peace. She was no longer the Apache girl exiled for her looks. She was a wife, a mother, a grandmother. The cowboy who had ridden into her life had not just stayed for a day or a season. He had stayed for a lifetime. Together, on their own terms, on their own scrap of earth, they had done the most extraordinary thing. They had turned a story of solitude into a story of home. And in the end, that was all the belonging she had ever needed.